So the first speaker after the break is myself. In my lab, we primarily work on optimization and learning-based approaches to robotics with a variety of different applications in mind. There's a lot of areas where learning and optimization can play a role in robotics, and I'm listing some of the areas that we're working on right now. The main one I want to focus on in this talk is optimization-based motion planning and reinforcement learning. So let's start with the motion planning problem. It's a very traditional problem. The goal is to go from a start state to a goal state. There are many methods out there, including sampling-based methods and A-star, which tend to explore the entire state space or a lot of the state space, and tend to have slow down when you work in higher dimensional spaces. Then there's a whole other line of work that uses optimization, and this started quite a while ago. Often it was reactive control, for example, Oussama's work on potential fields, which can work a lot faster, and recently have been shown, for example, through Chomp, Stomp, and iTomp, to be surprisingly often successful at finding a path from start to goal, despite, in principle, they could have a lot of local optima. So what do these methods look like? In the optimization, you minimize some objective, let's say path length, so the sum of the squared distances traversed at each time step, maybe some other costs. Initially, your joints are in a start state. At the end, your joints need to be such that your robot is in the goal set. There are some joint limit constraints. And then for all robot parts and for all obstacles, there should be no collision along the path that you want to execute. This latter one is the hard one. This makes the problem non-convex and makes it computationally more challenging to solve this problem. In recent years, there's been a lot of work on sequential convex programming. And the idea there is that you solve a non-convex problem by locally approximating it by a convex problem, solving the convex problem locally within a region, then updating your convex approximation, iterating over this until you reach a local optimum of your original problem. The tricky part here is to incorporate the no collision constraints into these sequential convex programming methods. And so here's one way to do this. If you had one robot link and one obstacle, you could characterize the distance between them. The signed distance is how far you need to move to get two objects out of collision, or if they are not in collision, how far you need to move to get them into collision. And you could then penalize as a function of the signed distance, where the penalty is 0 if two objects are a safe distance apart, and penalize more and more as they get closer to collision and even higher when they are in collision. You can then translate this loss onto the joint configurations of the robot using the Jacobian for a local approximation. And this would allow you, in your sequential convex programming approach, to account for collisions, at least in a local approximation. If you want to account for collisions over time, so from time t to t plus 1, you could sweep out the volume that's being traversed by each link of the robot, and then do the collision check on the swept out volume rather than on the shapes at time t and t plus 1 separately. It turns out that aside from this being better in terms of avoiding collisions over continuous time, it also turns out to condition your optimization problem in a better way, and you end up finding better local optima because now you're more fully considering the trajectory rather than a discrete set of points along the trajectory. So you really end up reshaping your trajectory as a whole. Now, with these local approaches, of course, there are no guarantees. And so the way to justify that they might work well is to build up a benchmark where there's a large set of test cases and see how often they succeed within a certain amount of running time. So we set up a benchmark with PR2 being required to do a variety of motion planning tasks, and compared this optimization-based approach that we worked on, which we call TrajOpt, with some of the state-of-the-art methods, bidirectional RT, and Chomp, which is also an optimization-based method. What you see here in the first row is the success rate, the fraction of problems on which the approach has success. The second row is the time spent on the average until success has been reached. And then the last row is the path length. So how long is the path that you find? Shorter is better. First table is for arm planning, 7 degrees of freedom. And then the second table is for 18 degrees of freedom. This is the full PR2 body motion planning problem. And so we see that with this TrajOpt local optimization approach, you can actually solve quite a few problems. In fact, more than with RRTs, if you are restricting yourself to a finite amount of running time. We've done experiments with other robots than PR2. These ones are all in simulation. So we've looked at the Atlas robot, 34 degrees of freedom. We've had successful experiments on box picking with the robot that was modeled after the industrial perception setup that Kurt and Gary had at the time. And then also curvature constraint planning, such as you encounter for needle steering. You can try this out yourself. The code is available, not just the code, but also mini tutorials are available to work with this code. You can try it out on many different examples. So that's the motion planning part I wanted to talk about. Another project I want to highlight is the reinforcement learning project. The idea here is that the input to the algorithm is now a state space, a goal state, full state information while you execute, and the ability to send controls to your system, but you don't have a dynamics model to start out with. So you don't know how your system will behave. You just know it has a certain number of degrees of freedom, and you have access to those degrees of freedom. The task is to still go from a start state, wherever you start, to the goal state. And the assumption is that there is some dynamics model. So the assumption is that you do know what the degrees of freedom are, but you just don't know how they behave dynamically. And there's quite a bit of closely related work by Mark Dijsenroth and his collaborators. And so the challenge here is to somehow explore the state space, find a dynamics model, and somehow then use that dynamics model to reach the goal state in an efficient way. The approach we follow is model-based reinforcement learning. And what that means here is that we have a while loop that keeps going until we have success. And the first step is to run sequential convex optimization with your current model. Initially, that's essentially an empty model, so not much will come out of that. But once you've collected some data, that model will become more and more refined. And according to your current model, you plan a path to the goal state. Your current model typically is quite inaccurate, and you keep track of how accurate it is. And within some bounds, within some confidence bounds, you're allowed to be optimistic. This is something very common in reinforcement learning, where you're in the phase of uncertainty, where your model is not accurate yet. You're allowed to be optimistic, and you're hopeful that whatever you don't know yet will work in your favor. So the optimization will optimistically plan with a current dynamics model. Then it'll execute the first 1/10 of a second of the plan. It'll get the data, use that data to update the dynamics model, and then it'll go back, replan, and keep iterating this. And as time goes by, of course, it'll explore more of the space, the confidence intervals will shrink, and it'll plan more and more accurate plans towards the goal. To account for the fact that we don't have a dynamics model, not even a parameterized model with unknown parameters, just nothing, we use a Gaussian mixture model and to regulate the number of components in the Gaussian mixture model, we use a Dirichlet process, which will automatically adapt the number of Gaussian mixture components to the richness of the data that you collect. So here's an example. Test case, cart pole, 2 degrees of freedom, so a 4-dimensional state space. Start with the pole hanging down. The goal is to find a way to swing it up, but keep in mind the system that's running the control here doesn't know it's controlling a cart pole. It just knows it's controlling something with 2 degrees of freedom and 1 control input. If you run the algorithm described on the preceding slide, this is what you get. So at this point, it's building up its model. It's trying to get to the goal. Optimistically, it's always thinking it's going to get there, but actually doesn't. But then after about 10 seconds, it figures out how to swing up and get to the goal. Here's a little more statistical information. If we do this over 10 runs, after about 40 seconds, each of these runs has succeeded. The reason this is not deterministic is because the first 10 seconds of the run, we apply stochastic control inputs. So there's just a stochastic sequence of control inputs. And so initially, things are random, and then from there on, it starts trying to find the best path to the goal under an optimistic interpretation of the current model. And right now, what we're looking at here is to see if we can extend this computationally from 2 degrees of freedom to 6 is what we would need to have a helicopter learn to fly on its own. Thanks. Our next speaker is Konolige from, I don't know, are you still at Industrial Perception?
I am at
You
Industrial
are?
Perception.
From Industrial Perception.
It does seem to work. My career path has probably been a little bit different from most people, and I know there are a lot of grad students here, so don't take this as a tale to be followed. You probably want to do things the inverse of what I did, which was to work at SRI International for longer than I care to think, doing mostly DARPA projects, which were very interesting. Then go to Willow Garage. So Steve talked about that, and we're one of the spin-outs from Willow Garage, which is one way to characterize it is kind of a halfway house between academia and industry. So, one foot in both of those places, and you get to try out a lot of nice things that might go to products at the same time that you still had strong academic foundation with that. And then finally, a high-risk company, so a spin-out from Willow Garage that was started with 3 others and is a team of about 9 people now. So we've been going about a year and a half. And the basic idea in spinning out from Willow Garage was to try to put into practice some of the things we had been doing there, and especially very good 3D perception and vision. And looking for opportunities in the industrial world to do that, because industry is halfway between real live activities in very open environments. You can control things quite a bit in industry. So we looked at that and realized that, well, we were very naive. We didn't really realize much about industry at all, but over the last year or so, we realized how things actually work there. So there's a lot of stuff going on that doesn't involve any sensing at all, so other than very simple brake beams. For instance, this kind of depalletizing doesn't have any sensing. You just have to know that everything is actually there. The typical situation tends to have a lot of, for sortation, for instance, for trying to distribute packages, companies invest in these very large warehouse systems that are very inflexible. Again, with hardly any sensing going on here and certainly no vision. So we looked around for applications that could actually benefit from vision, and we found really interesting ones. So, for instance, one of the largest uses of robots and one of the first uses was in welding for cars. But it turns out that every now and then the welding tip will hit something and get bent, and you have to kind of try to figure out where it got bent to. They currently use single laser brake beams. It takes a while to actually do that. They tout, 2 lasers as being a real advance in the field. We figured we could just do this by looking at vision, and indeed, if you just look at that with a camera, take several images, you can pretty much localize where that needle tip is, and that's what that video showed. But of course, the venture capitalists would laugh at us if we came to them and said this is what our application is. In fact, some of them actually did laugh at us. It was quite funny. And we eventually settled on a different application. But let me say first, it's not like vision isn't used vision and robotics aren't used in industrial automation. So, for instance, almost all your breakfast foods are handled by a robot at some point. So think about that the next time you eat pancakes. And they're handled very well. But the kind of vision that you get here is very, very much 2D. And there are companies like Cognex, very large companies that do this stuff, and especially for things like quality control, they really do well. So, but we realized there were other applications that were not so well controlled. So we settled on doing box picking from, I don't know the time, by the way. Is there a timing going on? Okay. We settled on doing box picking, trying to pick boxes from trucks. And this is one of the videos from an early experiment that we actually did. Here the environment is somewhat controlled. You're in a truck. You know you have boxes, maybe of a certain size, but you still don't know quite where they are. And in fact, we started out as a perception company trying to find the boxes so that another company, Winright Robotics, a robotics integrator, could actually perform all the motion control. We just kind of throw the coordinates of the box over the fence to them. They would perform the motion control and actually pick up the boxes and put them on the conveyor. I don't know if you can see it, but the boxes shake every now and then. There's a lot of dynamics going on here that we don't really model and probably should at some point. We realized fairly early on that we couldn't just be a vision company. And the reason is that the motion itself is, if we want to get very fast, so in industry, speed is of the essence. So you have to get down to about 5 seconds a box pick, say, to make this actually viable. And if you just work with current robot technology, that big controller box right there, you see, handles everything. Yes, this is our famous box throwing demo. You can find this on the web. Then you'll realize very quickly that robots can be programmed to go from point A to point B, but you can't tell them how to get there. I mean, there are very few ways that you can actually tell them to do that kind of thing. So very quickly, we learned that we had to take our perception, and if we wanted to be efficient, we had to pair that up with motion control, both for active vision, for finding where we wanted to look, and also for making efficient paths that would let us go around. So that's over the last year or so, we've had to actually do that part of robotics, and we've actually teamed up with Pieter's group and John Schulman in particular to help develop some of the motion control and optimization of trajectories for robotics, and that's been a very interesting journey. Unfortunately, we can't be 99% sure of these things, or 98%, because if you actually have that robot knock into something, then of course you're screwed. So we have to, the requirements for industry are quite a bit different. So there are a number of things that we actually needed to do. First of all, we needed to take 3D seriously. In this kind of environment, if we don't want to hit other boxes, if we want to be sure about our trajectories, we have to have a full 3D model of the environment, and we have to constantly update it at the same time, right? So we had to really take that seriously. And we also had to take seriously the notion of motion control. And finally, we had to be able to take paths that we developed, trajectories that we developed, and put them on that big box, which, as it turned out to be one of the hardest problems that we had to face, because robot companies don't want you to fool around with their big boxes, right? So they want you to just use their motion control commands. And I was just talking with some folks from KUKA last night, and they're just starting to say, yeah, well, maybe we can provide an interface that lets you control trajectories at the rate of, a couple milliseconds, so cycle time, so you can actually take trajectories that you've generated on a PC and throw them onto the robot. So that was one of the obstacles that we actually had to overcome. So here's one of the first applications where we actually looked at taking seriously the notion of 3D and update of the 3D model. So you can see it's a very simple model, and we're just using a camera on the end effector of the robot to update that model in depth and find the next box as we go through a cycle of picking this up. But it actually showed that we could do this, and we could pick these pallets with boxes of different size fairly easily and also fairly quickly. So the only stops that are actually in here is because we're using a Connect-type sensor, and if you move while you're using a Connect sensor, you're going to have a lot of motion blur. So that's a real problem in getting cycle time down fast, because you don't want to have to make those stops to settle down. Okay. So we've had to overcome a lot of these different problems, and part of that was led up to our current system that is actually able to do full volumetric modeling of the environment, update that in real time, do more precise localization and volumetric rendering for actually finding boxes. So you'll see in a minute there's a couple boxes that are somewhat hard to find, and do that all in real time while still enabling us to pick these very tough situations in some way in boxes. So here's a little bit of an idea of what the robot is actually thinking. I'm getting to the end of my time. As it scans the environment with a depth sensor in the end of the camera, it's building up that 3D model. So now we can use this to do collision detection. How to do that in real time is actually really still difficult, but involves. There are no questions allowed during these talks. It's a magic sensor. You can come talk to me afterwards. I'll talk to you about it. So you can see it building up the environment. I'm not going to have time to talk much about this, and I urge you to go on the web to find some of these videos and see what else we're actually doing. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Kurt. Our next presenter is Wang from UC Berkeley.
Hi, everybody. So my topic is vision guidance for industrial manipulators, considering sensing and dynamics limits. Talking about vision guidance for industrial robots, this is what we currently have, spin picking. It's a behind control law. It's called look, then move. And it is not real-time. It is not a real-time control strategy. And this picture here shows what we want next. It's like picking a moving part, moving in a sort of less predictable motion pattern from a hanging conveyor or something else. And it requires real-time vision guidance. By real-time, I mean like kilohertz real-time. So it looks like many well-done research in academic work, like this one here, a robot catching a moving ball. However, the problem of implementing this to that is, in academic world, people tend to abuse their funding. They buy really fancy hardwares, like a really high-speed vision system and a very light robot with very strong motors. However, in the industrial world, the problem is you always need to consider cost. You need to make it customer affordable. And so the usually situation is people use cost-effective or cheap vision systems, and they use really heavy robot to get the precision you need. And the motors are just okay to drive the robot. So to implement real-time vision guidance on industrial robots, basically we need to consider two parts of dynamics. You see, control is always about dealing with dynamics. Of course, we always got robot dynamics up there. And another dynamics we have is the so-called visual sensing dynamics, or VSD, which mainly includes latency and slow sampling. Talking about latency, usually a common vision system used by industrial robots gives that kind of latency, whereas we're talking about at least 1 kilohertz controller rate. So the most straightforward solution to get rid of visual sensing dynamics, or VSD, is to make high-speed vision system industrial affordable. So this picture here shows one of the devices that we first came up with. It is industrial affordable high-speed camera-like sensor. It is not an image camera. It requires markers. And it gives you pretty fast response and sub-millimeter precision accuracy, which are very considerable measurement range, like half meter by half a meter. And the pro is it's really, really affordable. It's like if you're trying to buy something like that on the market nowadays, it costs you around like $100K US. Examples include OptoTrack from Canada, where our system, I believe, it gives a cost lower than $1,000K US. But the problem is it requires markers. Oh, by the way, this piece of thing uses position-sensitive detector, and we call it PSD camera. And so what if markers are not allowed? What if manufacturers, they don't have time to attach markers on their workpieces and tools? So we have to deal with visual sensing dynamics directly with some sort of smart algorithms. So basically in our controller, we have this dedicated block that compensates the latency and slow sampling come from your cheap camera. So it is compatible with your 1 kilohertz controller. And in visual sensing dynamics, we have three things. Noise, that means we need to use some sort of statistical algorithm. And we have latency, that means we need to predict. And also we have slow sampling, which indicates multi-rate algorithms. So this algorithm here is one of the first algorithms that we came up with. I call it deep whitening dual rate adaptive common filter, aka DURA. And my colleague has a nickname for it, which is toothpaste. And nowadays, my colleague has developed a series of algorithms based on various learning methods, which is really marvelous. But basically, most of those algorithms, what they do is they predict today by reading newspapers before yesterday, and by learning some sort of a model. And here is when you apply it to a real robot. You can see if we turn off it, the robot tends to stumbling, and if we turn it on, the motion becomes really smooth, and the error got reduced. Thank you.
Thanks.
Our next speaker is Professor Allison Okamura from Stanford.
So first of all, thank you very much to Berkeley for hosting us today. I was an undergraduate at Berkeley and a graduate student at Stanford, and let me just say you always have to be loyal to your undergraduate alma mater when it comes to deciding who to root for at the big game. Great to be here. All right, so I decided to talk today about something that I guess I haven't really presented to a robotics audience before, so I'm curious to hear about people's thoughts. It's more of a neuroscience project that uses robotics, and it's about predicting and correcting people who have damage to the cerebellum and the deficits they have in their movement control using robotic models and devices. So the larger goal of rehabilitation robotics, of course, is if you have someone making movements which are irregular and variable like this, that somehow using a robot, either as an assistive device or as a rehabilitative tool that would only be used temporarily and then be taken away, could eventually make nice, smooth movements like controls or healthy people do. And then in the long term, you would love for these rehabilitative tools to be able to transfer recovery to activities of daily living, be used at home as orthotics or rehab devices. And ideally, you just don't want some sort of specialized strategy that helps people, but that you truly help them learn and correct their behavior at a fundamental level. And in order to do this, we need really good models, an understanding of the patient deficits. A lot of the rehab robotics field is about building devices that sort of move people's arms around in a way that we think might be helpful. But in order to be truly helpful, we postulate that you really need to understand the deficit. So in this talk, I'm going to be talking about using robots to help us understand the deficit, specifically for people who have damage to the cerebellum, which is a part of the brain, which is located back here. And it's thought by researchers to house a model of an internal model of the body's dynamics. So my limb segment lengths, inertias, maybe damping, etc. And this is thought because if you take a healthy person and you ask them to make a quick reaching movement, one that is so fast that you can't use peripheral feedback, which takes about 150 to 200 milliseconds, say for proprioception or vision, but you ask them to make a very quick movement which requires an internal model so you can do a feed-forward motor command, a healthy subject can do this task pretty well. You can see their shoulder and elbow joints and how they move there. But a cerebellar patient, someone who has damage to the cerebellum, will make a movement like this. They often overshoot, they have strange trajectories, and they also have more variabilities. So to hit home what this looks like, here's a video of a cerebellar patient doing a very simple task. It's just a chin or nose to finger task, just reaching back and forth. And if you try to do this yourself, you're going to be able to do this very quickly and accurately, but you can see the patient moves around and shakes and doesn't necessarily head in the right direction, even from the start. And the faster cerebellar patients move, the worse they get. So often patients with this sort of deficit, they actually wind up moving around the world very slowly because then they can use their peripheral feedback. So that's been more evidence for this internal model of the body's dynamics. So how do we use robots to help quantify and understand this deficit? Well, we can put patients, as well as healthy people, to sit in a very simple exoskeleton robot. It has two hands. It moves in the plane. This one comes from a company. It's called the Kin Arm, from a company called Beacon in Canada. And we can record people's movements. And so a controller, healthy subject, might make movements like this. This is spatial, and then this is the inverse dynamics, getting all the way down to what we think are the torques in the arm that resulted in those movements. And then we can also do this for cerebellar subjects. And the interesting thing is it definitely seems to be dependent on where you move in the workspace, giving more evidence that this probably has something to do with the body's dynamics. So we tested people in a very simple single joint flexion task, moving the arm in and out, and we get data like this. If we're just looking at position, this angle in 1 degree of freedom, and you're moving up to this target line, control subjects can do this very well. The interesting thing, and this has been a mystery for decades, is why some patients with damage to the cerebellum overshoot as they try to hit this target, whereas others undershoot. So this hypermetric patient overshoots and oscillates and comes back in this sort of weird underdamped behavior. And a hypometric patient has a different type of dysmetria. They undershoot, and then they finally recover and can get near the target after a little bit more time. So we would like to understand this more deeply. So one thing that we would like to do is take healthy people and see if there's something that we can do to them with a robot that can make them look like cerebellar patients. And we were able to achieve this by trying to mess with their body's dynamics. So we would have people make these reaching movements, healthy people, and then we would use the robot to suddenly change their inertia, increase it or decrease it. And we weren't sure that maybe inertia was the problem, so we also tried viscosity, stiffness, and some other things. Now, with a healthy person, you can only do this once because people actually, if you're healthy and your brain can adapt to these deficits that the robot is now introducing, then we won't really get much good data after a single reach. But for these very single reaches with that are unexpected for the user, we actually get this variety of hypermetric and hypometric behaviors from these types of perturbations. And it looks like these are very similar to what we see in cerebellar patients. So we actually have an extremely simple model for the control system in the brain for this sort of task. And while we don't think this is exactly what goes on in the brain, I'm definitely not pushing that idea. The fact that you have a very simple model that can describe this behavior can lead you towards some ways to approach treatment of this deficit. So with this model, we can actually generate the same exact types of deficits that we saw in healthy people as well as patients by perturbing their inertia, viscosity, etc. So the key thing that we found is that we really could say that inertia is probably the main thing that is affecting these patients' ability to move correctly. Because if we look at the amount of error they have in their, what we think is their inertial model in their head versus how they actually move, that's a pretty good correlation to the amount of dysmetria they have. And that dysmetria can be sometimes hypermetria, overshoot, or hypometria, undershoot. And this is actually true across a variety of different types of cerebellar deficits that our patient population has. So we now take these folks and we use the exoskeleton robot, and we use the robot now to change their inertia. We basically do inertia rendering on the robot, which is actually challenging because basically you're trying to get the device to output torques, which are a desired inertia multiplied by an acceleration measurement. So there's some interesting signal processing issues that go into trying to render these inertias very precisely, but we have to do it in order to be rendering the correct inertia to change these deficits. So this is someone using the exoskeleton robot to try to hit some targets in this environment. Okay, so this is the results of doing this with cerebellar patients. Since we took every patient and we found their specific deficit, that is their hypothesized inertia error that would result in their hypometric or hypermetric behavior, we could look at these two groups, one with hypermetria, and I'll show the hypometry one in another minute, and try to apply this inertia, additive inertia with the exoskeleton robot and see if we could improve their reaching movement. So here are a bunch of individual data, and you have a bunch of data points from some different subjects before we applied our help with changing the inertia of the arm using the exoskeleton robot, and then after. And then if you put all of these together and you look at these as group data, since there's quite a lot of variability, before their dysmetria is up here, and after it's much lower. So obviously there's still some variability, but on the whole, we are improving the patient's behavior. Now, hypometria was the case where you were undershooting, and this actually works there as well. So if before their dysmetria was over here, we can correct it, and the group data does pretty much the same thing. So it's interesting that we could apply this very general idea to patient populations whose behavior was actually quite different in terms of the type of error they got. So the punchline results are that we can use patient-specific biases to try to represent their dynamics and understand them. We can replicate this dysmetria in healthy people using a robot to perturb them, as well as in simulations. And we can also partially correct the dysmetria by altering a patient's limb inertia using an exoskeleton robot. And this is very exciting, but of course this is only scratching the surface. It doesn't correct trial-to-trial variability, and variability is higher in cerebellar patients than it is in healthy people. And so that's still a challenge that we're working with. But the big picture here for us is that, like surgery or any other robot-assisted intervention, in rehab robotics, we should be able to quantitatively describe a patient's state in order to generate a model so we can plan intervention, design robotic systems, and incorporate human inputs into them. So I'll just conclude by thanking everyone in my lab, and particularly the folks I've worked with on cerebellar ataxia. Thanks.
Our next speaker was supposed to be Radu Rusu, but unfortunately something came up really last minute for Radu, and he had to cancel. So we picked our funniest speaker of the morning, Steven, and got him to come again.
All right, so I'm back this time to talk about recent advances in PCL, because Radu bailed out at the last minute. So most of the information here is Radu's, but the lame jokes are still mine. So lame jokes, possible excuses that Radu let me give, because he didn't tell me why. He could be sick, I saw that. His wife is pregnant, so congratulations. And he might have just not felt like doing his job today. But either way, I'm sure he's very sorry, and he wanted to be here. Okay, so first, a fun fact. Most people, when they hear about the point cloud library, they think it's about cloud computing. And so that's great, because the cloud is this thing that gets you grant money and VC money, this nebulous force. But we are talking about point clouds, so 3D points in space. Okay, so a little background. I'm going to start with why do we care about 3D, and then move into what is the point cloud library. Okay, so why do we care about 3D? Well, times are changing. So personal robotics is on the rise. We've got cars driving themselves. And wearable computing is also coming. And all of this means that 3D visualization and handling is going to be increasingly important in the next few years. Also, because 2D alone might have failed us, and that's not to be mean to any of the people that have done great research here. But if you look at something like Google Goggles, so we can't really read this, but great company doing great work in 2D, and the public just is not convinced by it. And that's not surprising, because it's really hard to solve the 2D problem. Lighting invariance is very difficult. Mapping texture as opposed to shape is a big problem. And even some of our best algorithms in tracking, for instance, without the ability to do some geometric verification, they're going to find mugs out in space. When you just have edges, that's what you have to work with. And even the algorithms that are tried and true will still fail sometimes. Also, I think 2D is just hard without semantic understanding, a little ill-defined even. For instance, without depth perception or a really good understanding of how humans behave, you just can't work with this. Also, because being biologically inspired isn't always the best way to go when we're working with a robot here. So I know humans use mostly monocular, a little bit of stereo. But if we have these sensors, we should work with them. Also, because this is a convergence of a lot of fields right now. So we've got new sensors coming out, PrimeSense ones, Intel, gaming and mobile. And pretty excitingly, a lot of these will be embedded in a phone very soon. So they're working on camera arrays, passive stereo, and we're going to have to deal with this data. So meet PCL. So this is what PCL looked like when it started in, I think, late 2010. And it's grown a color scheme, but it's still pretty similar. And PCL lies at the intersection of robotics, gaming, and just surveying the community. So it's mostly horizontal growth. So we're trying to build a platform that everyone can use. But then we still try to push the limits of when new research gets out, we want to put it in the library. So we have a lot of modules, kind of built off of OpenCV's way of doing things. So we have filters, you can compute features, key points, register scenes. CUDA, we even have mobile libraries, so you can visualize things on an iPhone or an Android phone or in your browser. So a lot of different work going on. And now, so this is a very complicated web of things that we have here. 3D is a hard problem. So we have a team that's dedicated to have unit tests, peer review, trying to do things officially as we scale this. And we're growing very fast. So at the start, there was only one user, that was Radu. And now, just a few years later, we've got over 700 contributors and tens of thousands of people using this. So it's really on the rise. But we still have a long way to go. We're scattered all over the world. So we've got people here in America, out in Europe, Asia, Australia, anywhere where there are roboticists, then we have people. And millions of hits on the domains. And we're also partnering with industries, too. So a lot of people, like Google or Honda or Toyota, will want to pay money just to fuel the way that the research is going to go in PCL. So we'll have things called code sprints, where we have students basically work on their research, directed open source still in a certain way. And in response, the companies are happy, and we're happy. So we're working with a few newer ones, too. So Aptina, we've got Pelican. OK, so what's new in the library? Well, first, Radu put this in. I guess we were the first open source project to sponsor a conference. If you're one that did it, then blame him. I don't know. We're also trying to help the job crisis. So the way we do that is it turns out that PCL is growing to the point where expertise in this is actually a skill that's marketable. So different companies will make a posting where they want a person who can contribute to PCL part-time, and in exchange, adapt it to meet their company needs. We also moved to GitHub, which is something I was rooting for a while. And so I was pushing for it. What changed Radu's mind in the end is it looks like GitHub is here for a long time. More maintainers are growing every day, and core developers are hard at work trying to funnel the library in the right direction. We've also got more code, so we did a code release this year, better ROS integration thanks to the Open Source Robotics Foundation. More hardware, so most 3D sensors that you can find on the market, we're building ways to adapt them to our software. And we're also trying to solve some hard problems. So I'll try to make it a little bit personal here. So the way that I got involved with PCL more long-term, I'd been pushing a bit, is I actually met Radu at a bar last year to talk about some stuff. And he asked me, how would you like to go to Japan? And I said yes. So a month later, I was in Japan doing contract work with these guys. And so the work that they're trying to do here is they have an industrial robotic platform. They're doing motion planning. And what they needed is a way to build a CAD model of the environment to plan in and register the robot to it. So like Kurt was saying before, industry demands are very different from regular research demands. So we tried to build a nice web browser for them, as much verification as possible, make sure that all the data it got was good. And of course, checks for if it is missing something, then they could go back, rescan. And in the end, wind up with a model that isn't necessarily beautiful, but has all the occlusion information they need to plan. And so in the end, they've got a robot hit play, and the robot can navigate around objects. We've also got a project going on with Toyota, trying to do object segmentation and clutter. The basic idea here is that the normal table plane segmentation methods we use in robotics doesn't always work in the real world. So we have a few researchers hard at work trying to find more principled ways to segment out the data. We've been working with HRI for a while, Honda Research. And so what they've been interested in is having a stereo for their car to try to get depth on the street, and then also to try to segment the road from the rest of the environment. So I think you'll see in a second initial segmentation results for them. But we're hard at work making it better. So there's a new code sprint now where we're trying to get even more high-fidelity labeling. And finally, we've been working with NIST to try to do multiple human pose tracking. So this is with a mounted Kinect sensor, just trying to follow people, again, with heavy occlusion. And this is still ongoing work. So I think I'm a little short, but you should come join the movement at pointclouds.org. It's a great library, and we need your help. Thanks.
Our next speaker is John Schulman from UC Berkeley.
About enabling robots to do tasks that involve deformable objects. And some motivating problems are autonomously assisting with surgery, doing laundry, and some manufacturing tasks that involve cables and springs. And deformable object manipulation is extremely challenging. First, it's really hard to the vision problem of perceiving the state of the object is hard. Then if you had good state estimation, it would be hard to do an accurate simulation of the object. And even if you had perfect state estimation and simulation, then it would be hard to do use a planning or control algorithm because of the high-dimensional state space. So my research has addressed a few aspects of this problem. There's I did some work on tracking deformable objects and then high-dimensional motion planning. But the next few minutes of this talk will be about learning from human demonstrations how to autonomously do a manipulation task. So the problem we'll be considering is tying knots in rope. So let's say the human demonstrated how to tie a knot from a certain starting configuration shown on the top. And now we want to get the robot to tie a knot starting from a different initial configuration. So let's look at a simpler problem just to get some intuition for this, how the algorithm is going to work. So let's say the environment, the object just consists of 4 dots. And the task is to draw this curve shown by the dotted line around them. So now we get 4 dots in different places, and now we want to generate a sensible trajectory for this new situation. So what you can do is you first find correspondences between the points, and then you can think of those as samples. You have a function, a nonlinear coordinate transformation that maps from the training scene to the testing scene, and you have 4 samples of that function. And basically, we're going to fit a function that now maps the whole space of the training scene onto the testing scene. And then you take that function and you apply it to your trajectory. So now you get a trajectory that has the right relationship to all the key points from the testing scene. And mathematically, the way you can do this is you write down a cost functional that says that we want our function f to have as low curvature as possible, so it's as close to an affine function as possible, while doing the right thing on our sample points. And the particular formulation we use is called the method of thin plate splines. So now by using this idea of registering scenes together and warping your trajectory, you can tie knots, get a robot to tie knots. So here my colleague is recording a demonstration of how to tie an overhand knot in a piece of rope. So note that there are a few different stages of the task, a few separate stages. 3 stages there. So now the rope is laid out in a new configuration, and the robot's going to tie a knot autonomously. So each stage, it's going to look at the rope, it gets a point cloud, and it does non-rigid registration, which means it finds this function that maps the training scene onto the testing scene. And it does that thing 3 times, once before each step, for the overhand knot. And here's a slightly more complicated knot. Same algorithm, same exact algorithm, just with a different demonstration. This is all in 3D, even though it's just showing it in 2D. With the rope, only 2D is relevant, but this also works in 3D. All right. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, John. Okay, our next presenter is Gary Bradski.
So I'm gonna be talking about OpenCV 3.0. Among the many hats I wear, this is one of them. So OpenCV is it's been around a long time. More than a decade, 14 or 15 years. So what is it? Probably you all know, but it's open source computer vision library. It's BSD license, free for commercial research. It spans a whole bunch of language interfaces, so C++, Python, Java, and now MATLAB we've added. So we're adding complete interfaces. You got to, excuse me. C++, of course, is full. Python is now a complete, custom full interface. MATLAB is getting that way, and Java. We run on all the major OS, and there's been, a several years emphasis on running on mobile in many examples, and that's all there. It plays in well with robotics because, a lot of times you at least with personal and whatever, you have energy constraints, that sort of echo mobiles. Okay, it's quite a comprehensive computer vision library. Basically, every area of computer vision is in there somewhere to some extent. A lot of calibration. There's more and more sort of 3D support also, Connect support and other depth sensors. All kinds of image transforms, optical tracking, structure from motion. We have a lot of stuff coming in there, stereo depth, and on and on. OpenCV is, it's extremely well used. I get emails every week. Some guy in Iran is using it, to target missiles now. They're inviting me there. I said, you'd cut my head off if I'd go. But in mine safety, if you use Street View, you're using some functions from OpenCV. It's everywhere. If industrial perception and my current place I haven't mentioned that I'm in are using it heavily. So it's all over the place. I've seen swimming pool safety systems and on, and many mobile startups now are using it. So the current status is we're it's hard to track because we weren't always on the same platform, but we're over 8 million downloads. It's going about 200K a month now. We formed a nonprofit, OpenCV.org, and that's how we're operating now. We recently got in, large-scale supporters, so Intel's come in with major funding that'll back a team. OpenCV will soon, for Intel architectures, you'll also be able to download their performance primitives for free, and their perception library, gesture recognition, whatever, will come in, for free on platforms. Google's been a big supporter. This year they supported 16 students for a summer of code. We're getting government funding, and I'm actually hiring a project manager. If someone wants to help run stuff, we have funding now, to start that position. The websites are below. OpenCV.org is the user site. Developers is code.opencv.org, and docs are docs.opencv.org. So those are always online. You can build them yourself, though. Okay. This is sort of the timeline, 1999, 2000 was the first alpha. OpenCV 1.0 was C interface, came on in 2006. 2009 saw a change to C++, and now we're going on to 3.0, which is sort of completing a modern software architecture around C++ with all those other language, but really making it modular and really starting to work on honing. So we're actually making, the core of the library is going to have less functions, but better tuned, better optimized. And then there'll be this cloud of very modular stuff. So, Y 3.0, that's time for a change. But also, we're supporting the C, but it used to be some of the C++ was wrapping the C. Now the C will be wrapped C++. So it'll all be one code base. There's a lot of architectural changes, and a lot of this is an answer to needs users brought up in mobile and in Google and for cloud computing. They want memory can be extreme constraint, and so we have very modular, closed memory is coming with 3.0, and also there's now a lot. We're working a lot on this committee for developing hardware acceleration. The same thing that's doing OpenCL, OpenGL. Well, there's OpenVX, and we're driving that committee, and so we're working with a lot of people on just seamlessly going into hardware acceleration. So I've said some of these things. Maybe should move on. One of the things is scaling. Vision, when we started out, Vision didn't work, and I always felt guilty about encouraging students to do it because I thought, well, they're doomed. I'll see them in the pizza parlor, after their postdoc. But instead, like Vision people have never had a recession, right? I'm still hiring, and I am hiring, come to me for something very exciting. But they're hard to hire still, so it's been a good field. But now that it works, what do? We've got 3,000 functions. Do we have 30,000? Well, the modularity will help with this, and that we'll have a site where you can post functions and maintain it, and there'll be a build bot on it. But the core will be something much more professional, and we'll take, as it gets popular, things from another site, and CMake will easily manage it. So I talked about this modular structure and this HAL, the hardware abstraction layer on the low-level operation. So we'll seamlessly work with hardware accelerations over mobile and other devices. This is what the module will look like to the user. You'll just fill in a very simple function. It'll have doc, it'll go into build bots, and everything's running on Git development, and CMake can pull in extra things, and this will make it scalable for the future. So, what are the HAL accelerators? There is a lot of work now going on at OpenCL acceleration by several major players. There's a CUDA, being done by NVIDIA that's already fairly far along. There's IPP and Intel Accelerations is working with this, and on and on. Open, VX support is in the works because we're on that committee. As soon as there is a definition of exactly what that is, it's sort of a multi-year journey for getting all the agreements. This is Summer of Code. This just happened this summer, and these are some of the things that we're already in. In red are the ones that I have videos of. So high dynamic range imaging, and there's computational photography. Again, that's mobile kind of support. We got Malix, human-like segmentation. Line segment detection is something I found very useful in my work, so that's in optimized. Structure from motion, we're getting a lot of structure from motion stuff in, so there's a visualizer now. And text detection and scene, a complete Python tutorial, since we have a complete Python interface. There was a lot of work done on that. A lot of work was done on Android examples, so we're really working well with Android. So here's just the recent contributions, and let me pull up this and hope that it works. So here's just some of the stuff that came in this summer. This is text detection and scenes, so useful for many things, but it's working pretty well. So this is contributions. Now everything's Git. These are coming in from around the world. This is the line segment detection, if you can see this in purple. But basically, line segment detection is finding every meaningful line you would think there'd be to outline in a scene. This is the visualizer for structure and for motion, so it's following this sinusoidal arc, and you're able to view this. In this case, he's just making a camera path. So these are some of the things that came in. And hopefully that one's not. This is the Python tutorials, complete tutorials. Maybe I can speed this one up as we're running out of seconds. And I wanted to get to, this is the segmentation that was developed by Malik and his group. So, very human-like segmentation. So that's all in there as of now. You can get it on Git. That's it.
Thanks, Gary.
Our next presenter is Majewicz from Stanford.
Some things. Hi, I'm happy to be here, especially because we've actually collaborated a lot with people at Berkeley on the needle steering project. My name is Anne, and let me just start with a little bit of motivation for steerable needles. So the motivation is that straight line paths don't always exist to targets within tissue due to obstacles, such as in this case, we have a little vessel that's blocking the path. And so steerable needles could be used to steer around these obstacles. So we use long, thin, flexible needles with asymmetric tips. And as the needle inserts, it deflects due to asymmetric tip forces. And then we can control where the needle steers by rotating the needle. And we can actually model this behavior as a non-harmonic system, such as a unicycle. So as I said, we collaborated closely with people here at Berkeley, particularly Ken Goldberg's group, and they've contributed a lot to path planning algorithms that enable autonomous needle steering. However, there's several challenges with autonomous needle steering, namely limitations in terms of medical imaging, dynamic intraoperative environments, which can cause the operative plan to quickly change, and then finally, how the tissue feels is actually a critical feedback mechanism for the surgeon to detect what kind of tissue the needle is in. And so for these reasons, we think it's important to have a surgeon in the control loop. And we're proposing to do this with a teleoperation strategy using a haptic device like the Phantom Omni. And so we considered two possible teleoperation strategies. The first is having the user control the needle inputs, insertion, and rotation. And this is called joint control. However, we actually thought this would be kind of difficult. So just imagine how hard it would be to parallel park a car in 3D. And that's sort of what this would be like. So instead, we proposed another method where the user controls the needle tip directly. And that's what we call Cartesian space teleoperation. So our method works by iteratively planning constant curvature paths to connect the user desired position to the current needle tip position, and then steering the needle along that path. And because we're using a haptic device, we can give force feedback to the user so they can feel the kinematic constraints, and we might also be able to play back the tissue so they can feel the tissue as well. So here's a video of a user teleoperating a simulated needle using Cartesian space teleoperation. And in a human subject experiment that we presented at World Haptics this year, we showed that subjects can control steerable needles with Cartesian space control more quickly and with straighter paths using our method. So to implement this with a robotic system, as the user moves the haptic device along the desired needle path, we iteratively define constant curvature arcs between the needle and the user desired position. And the needle position and heading can be found using a 6-degree freedom electromagnetic tracker. And then we steer the needle along that path by first rotating the needle to the steering plane. The needles steer in 2D. And then control path curvature with something called duty cycle spinning. And then we repeat this process until the user stops moving. So now let me talk a little bit more about how to control the path curvature. So in duty cycle spinning, the needle path curvature is controlled by alternating between pure insertion with insertion while continuously spinning. And there's two issues with this method. One that I won't talk about due to time is that there's inherent error that propagates over long insertions. And then the second very practical issue is that you actually can't use sensors that have cables because the cables will wind up. So we proposed two different methods that don't require continuous spin. One, as the name implies, bidirectional duty cycle spinning, means that we alternate the direction of rotation, either, oh, actually, let me turn this up so you can hear it. Let me see if I can play that again. So basically, we just alternate the rotation of direction, either clockwise or counterclockwise. And the second method, duty cycle flipping, is basically where the needle inserts in discrete steps, either facing left or right. And then the duty cycle ratio is then a function of the time inserted facing left versus the time inserted facing right. And we evaluated our algorithms in a paper recently that we submitted to ICRA. And I actually took out the slide due to time, but I realized I didn't need to do that. Talking fast, sorry. And so basically, we found no difference between the two methods, except that in duty cycle flipping, you have higher insertion force variance, while insertion spinning has higher insertion torque variance. And that's going to be an issue that will be important to address as we think about the implications for tissue damage moving forward. So, thank you.
Our next presenter and last presenter for the morning is Oussama Khatib from Stanford.
Thank you. I thought today would be a good idea to think about where we're going with humanoid robotics. And a lot of progress getting robots to move in the free space, to run, to jump, to hop. But are they really going to be useful for something? That is, are they really going to do any task such as like the one on the left here? If I get the So think about this task. In fact, Honda demonstrated this task in 2011, and just programming this task would take over probably 2, 3, 4 weeks of adjustment of all the gains, all the positions, every aspect of it to be successful. And if we change anything in that environment, everything is going to fail. So manipulation has been a big challenge in robotics over the years. And again, in terms of humanoid robotics, it's going to be more and more challenging unless really we work on that problem. So interacting with the world that is going beyond manipulation, mobility, and building a framework where we really integrate the whole body, mobility and manipulation, is a very, very important thing. So the question is not to take a humanoid robot and to try to teach it how this robot can perform that specific task. The question is to understand skills, to understand independently of the robot, how can we understand a skill, what is a manipulation skill, how we can build that skill, and then map that skill to a platform, a robot, a humanoid robot. So humans are amazing as a model for us to think about skills. And one thing we can do is to take a task and perform it by the human, record so motion capture the motion, look at the strategy, look at the forces, movement, and essentially extract the strategy, extract the compliant frame, extract the center of compliance, and then now have a strategy to implement autonomously on the robot. So this is the direction that we are exploring. This is one of the directions. There are a lot of things that could be done haptically. Haptically, we can, in fact, interact with the environment by controlling the robot. And now the robot is almost autonomous. We are just controlling a few degrees of freedom of that robot. So the skills for manipulation are critical. And if we map them to humanoid robotics, now we have a much more challenging problem, because these have systems with many degrees of freedom, When they touch the environment, they will touch it at multiple points, and there will be a lot of internal forces, a lot of balancing questions, and how are we going to control them? Are we going to do inverse kinematics? Is it reasonable to think about inverse kinematics and programming all the different motions for every task? It would be impossible. So we need to understand the model, and then what we need to do is to think like what humans do. That is, we have multiple tasks we are achieving. We're performing a main task. We are maintaining a posture. Our posture will not interfere with the task, and both will not interfere with any constraints from the environment, like contact. And everything should deal with the idea of internal constraints and obstacles and all of those. Don't forget balance. Now, if we want to do this, this means we have multiple different operators running, and those controllers are autonomous and running separately, but we are merging them through this consistency. Consistency is a sort of projection in the null space of the task or of the posture and all the constraints, and that leads us to merge and build a controller that is coherent between the different things. So what is interesting about all of this is that all of this ends up to be a very simple point, one single point. All what we see here will result in one single point in high-dimensional space representing the constrained, consistent motions where all the different parameters related to the constraints are taken into account with the contact and the task. So when implemented, you can see an example here. We have the robot right hand holding to a contact while being guided by the human. The human is guiding a compliant motion, but the posture is controlled, the constraints are maintained, and here the robot is following the guidance of the human, and the robot is actually surprised. What's going on? What's happening here? And here we are teaching the robot where to reach in order to grasp an object, a specific object. And all of these are just examples. So here is an example of constraints. You remember potential field, but now potential field put in the context of not fighting with everyone else, avoiding the collision, and performing a task that maintains all these coherent controllers. Now, let's think about where we can take humanoid robotics. I mean, is it really useful for anything? One thing I think would be amazing if we can get this human to be replaced by a humanoid robot. And why? Humanoid robots brings this compact mechanism that has mobility, manipulation, vision, computation, sensing, all together in a confined space so that we can go in these narrow passages. And the problem is humanoid robots were designed for flat indoor environment. They were not designed for a three-dimensional environment. So how can we deal with this problem? And the only way we can think about it is by thinking, well, I mean, we have an environment. Let's touch the environment and let's not just ZMP ourselves walking on the flat floor. Let's move using the environment. So this idea requires a lot of attention to a lot of things in terms of internal forces, control, coordination between different things. And here is an extreme motion that you can see, detecting friction, detecting the slippage, and even moving the ground under the robot, and still we are balancing and maintaining all these. Once we have the proper controller and proper sensing, it is amazing what can be done. Now, not every time you have the environment to help you. How can we move when the environment is not helping? Well, let's make something that will help us to move in that environment. And this is the concept of supraped. The supraped is to bring extension of the support for the robot. We showed that we can do over 400% support. And now you can see a robot here. This is HRP4C moving in an environment where the robot is detecting, because these poles are smart and has sensors. In fact, we're working with Mark on building such a pole that will provide that feedback and information. And in the meantime, we developed the controller and detecting the friction, detecting the contact, and taking all of these things. So next, I wanted to show another application of those humanoid robotic, and this is underwater. This is a collaboration with Chaos Mecha, and the idea there is we really need to deal with those fragile environment, and we will not be able to take robots like this heavy machine that will break damage those environments, to place sensors and samples. So to extract anything from those environments, we send divers, and instead of divers, we would like to send the robot that will be and keep the diver on the boat through haptic interaction. And through fast communication and through the use of the dynamic interaction, we are going to be able to perform those motions. We are developing this project. We are building the different simulations. This is full dynamic simulations, and controlled by the human. And in the 5 seconds that is left, I'm going to show you a video made for space. The reason I selected this music was that I was invited to a workshop on space robotics, and I was talking about underwater robotics. They share a lot of commonality in terms of the control and navigation and flying. These are real dynamic simulations with real control in the water model. Thank you.
Thanks, Oussama.